Committee will come to order. In his January 19, 2018 remarks on the National Defense Strategy, Secretary Mattis warned that, quote, our competitive edge has eroded in every domain of warfare, air, land, sea, space, and cyberspace, and it is continuing to erode, end quote. Now, much of that erosion has been caused by things we've done to ourselves. Sequestration and continuing resolutions come to mind. But part of the erosion in our competitive edge is the result of adversaries and competitors obtaining American technology and intellectual property by legal and often illegal means. In its January 2018 report, China's Technology Transfer Strategy, DIUX, found that the People's Republic of China, for example, uses a variety of methods to obtain U.S. technology, including industrial espionage, where China is by far the most aggressive country operating in the U.S., cyber theft on a massive scale, deploying hundreds of thousands of Chinese Army professionals, academia, since 25% of U.S. STEM graduate students are Chinese foreign nationals, China's use of open source information, cataloging foreign innovation on a large scale, Chinese-based technology transfer organizations, U.S.-based associations sponsored by the Chinese government to recruit talent, and technical expertise on how to do deals learned from U.S. firms. That report noted that the cost of stolen intellectual property has been estimated at $300 billion a year. Most alarming, DIUX found that, again, I'll quote, the U.S. does not have a comprehensive policy or the tools to address this massive technology transfer to China, and the U.S. government does not have a holistic view of how fast this technology transfer is occurring, the level of Chinese investment in U.S. technology, or what technologies we should be protecting. That's the end of the quote. Now, I understand that the DIUX report is just one report, but based on everything this committee has learned and heard about over the course of this year, those conclusions sound right to me, and it should be alarming. There are several provisions in the upcoming NDAA conference which relate to this issue, including the modernization of CFIUS and export control regime. This hearing will better equip us to make important decisions in the days ahead. Let me yield to the ranking member for any comments he'd like to make.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think the most important part of your statement was at the end there is that we don't have a strategy to counter what is happening. I think the chairman is right, and the Secretary of Defense is correct, our advantage in a number of different areas has been eroding. Now, the biggest reason for that, I believe, is that the rest of the world is catching up. I mean, there was a substantial period of time there when it was really just the Soviet Union and us who were building on a significant level our military capacity. And we dominated the world economically and militarily post-World War II for a long period of time. That was never going to last forever. The rest of the world was going to develop ways to grow their economies, grow their technology, and eventually turn towards growing their defense, and that's what's happened. But what hasn't happened on our end is we haven't responded to that. Our strategy still seems to be based on the notion that we're still dominant, so we don't have to worry about these details. And I think that is dangerous and that we need to develop. But I'll just mention a couple of key areas, most of which the chairman mentioned. But to begin with, the CFIUS process of protecting our technology has long needed reform. Items that were not thought of as being national security are technology. How do we protect that? How do we make sure that adversaries aren't purchasing those companies and taking away our technology? I think what the Senate added to the defense bill is a great opportunity for us to update that process to help protect our technologies through the CFIUS process. And we have to get that right, and we're going to try to do that in the next 5-6 weeks. So we definitely want to be in touch, make sure the language is right, make sure what we're doing on that part is correct. The second piece of this is on the cyber piece, and we had a briefing yesterday on a cyber breach, and it was shocking how disorganized, unprepared, and quite frankly, utterly clueless the branch of the military was that had been breached. Even in this day and age, we still have not figured out how to put together a cyber policy to protect our assets, in particular with our defense contractors who we work with, who store our data but don't have adequate protection. But even within the DOD, we don't have a clear, cohesive policy to put in place. And then the third area of policy we don't have is we don't have an industrial policy. And again, I think this is a legacy of our dominance. We didn't have an industrial policy because we were dominant. In fact, example from my own neck of the woods, Boeing. Why is Airbus able to be subsidized and competitive? Well, because decades ago, we agreed to allow them in many instances to do that. And we did that because at the time, we had like 85% of the global aircraft manufacturing market. And we thought, well, isn't it cute? Airbus wants to compete, whatever, it doesn't really matter to us. Well, here we are with that flipped. They've stepped up and competed. And now we have not come through with a sensible idea of what technologies, what industries do we need to protect for our own national security. As the chairman will relate, I don't think it's flatware, but that seems to be the one thing that we wind up debating in the NDAA every year. While meanwhile, no offense to those in the part of the world who consider that important, but meanwhile, we are losing core technologies that are critical to defense, and no one really understands exactly why. The last piece of it I'll say that I think is important is trade. Now, we have a somewhat, I don't know what the word would be, unfocused approach right now to how we combat a competitive trade environment. The one thing we definitely should be doing is figuring out how to get on a more level playing field with China. It's not just our trade deficit with China, but it is the strategies that they have put in place to capture core technologies, to steal them in some instances, but a lot of it they're doing within the WTO framework. Some of it they're doing outside of the WTO framework, but we haven't put together a comprehensive strategy for changing that equation, whether it's bringing trade actions against them, whether it's trying to get them to change their policies. It is sort of a reactionary approach right now. So we need a strategy on this. I think this hearing is incredibly important. I look forward to the testimony of the witnesses, and I thank the chairman for convening it. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Pleased to welcome our witness today, the Honorable Michael Griffin, Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering, Honorable Kari, Bingen, Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence, Mr. Eric Chewning, Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Manufacturing and Industrial Base Policy, and Mr. Anthony Schinella, National Intelligence Officer for Military Issues. Thank you all for being here. Without objection, your written statement, it looks like there's just one to me, will be made part of the record. And we will turn it over to y'all for comments you'd like to make. Mr. Schinella, you're starting first, is that? Oh, y'all figure it out. Ms. Secretary, go ahead if you'd like.
I believe the earlier agreement was that I would start, sir.
Oh, great.
So thank you, first of all, Chairman Thornberry, Ranking Member Smith, members of this committee. We appear before you to discuss the very real Chinese adversarial behavior to which you have referred. And this is not about the threat of such behavior. This is real behavior. We are here to underscore the urgency with which all of us must focus our actions to maintain our technological and military dominance. I thank you for the trust you've placed in myself and my fellow witnesses to discuss this topic in this open setting as carefully as we can. We did, yes, sir, we did submit a single joint statement because we wanted to be together rather than separate. I think we have a common view of this topic. But our conversation today is only a handful of pixels in the entire picture of what we face. It is my, and I believe our deep belief that we must act now. But at the same time, it's my duty to limit my comments to those of a strictly unclassified nature. So as we go forward, I welcome, expect, and encourage more detailed discussions in a more restricted environment. I believe this will be necessary in the months and years ahead. This is not a problem with a short-term fix, sir. We are here in part to recognize that this is a whole of government, indeed a whole of society problem. And we're here in part to recognize and draw distinctions between adversaries and allies according to the behavior of the actor. No one believes more strongly than I in the value of international partnerships and alliances and in the value of international commerce and fair exchange. But the Chinese theft of technology and intellectual property through the exfiltration of the work of others is not unlike the Chinese construction of islands to encroach upon the geographic domains of international waters and those of other sovereign nations. It circumvents the autonomy of nations in a departure from a rules-based global order. It is adversarial behavior, and its perpetrator must be treated as such. The breadth and depth of Chinese malfeasance with regard not only to our technology but also to our larger economy and our nation is significant and intentional. As referenced in our written testimony, we are taking steps to counter it. You, as the Congress, have established my office in particular to regain and maintain the technological dominance that we as a nation have depended upon in the past. We pledge to you to do that, and with your help and support, we will. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions, and I yield to my colleagues.
Mr. Chairman Thornberry, Ranking Member Smith, and all members of this distinguished committee. Good morning, and thank you for welcoming me here to discuss this important topic. As the DNI's National Intelligence Officer for Military Issues, I am regularly tasked with reporting on threats to the U.S. military. There are, of course, the visible threats from foreign military forces and weapon systems. But the U.S. intelligence community also sees a less visible but dual threat from adversaries and competitors that are deliberately working to acquire U.S. research, technologies, and talent to improve their own military programs and erode the effectiveness of ours. More broadly, the ICSS's that foreign countries' acquisition of U.S. technology through licit and illicit means, as well as cheating on trade agreements, joint ventures, and exploiting scientific collaborations, have the potential to erode the U.S. competitive edge. Foreign countries, most notably China, are able to acquire and transfer critical U.S. technology through their intelligence services, foreign direct investments, joint ventures, open source science and technology acquisition programs, use of insiders, front companies, and scientific and business collaborations. This has potentially far-reaching consequences. As we have highlighted in the DNI's annual threat testimony, persistent trade imbalances, trade barriers, and a lack of market-friendly policies in some countries probably will continue to challenge U.S. economic security. Some countries almost certainly will continue to acquire U.S. intellectual property and proprietary information illicitly to advance their own economic and national security objectives. China, for example, has acquired proprietary technology and early-stage ideas through cyber-enabled means. At the same time, some actors use largely legitimate legal transfers and relationships to gain access to research fields, experts, and key enabling industrial processes that could, over time, erode America's long-term competitive advantages. Foreign actors, notably China and Russia, recognize that investing in and acquiring technology is absolutely essential to achieve their strategic goals. They want to develop weapon systems that strike farther, faster, harder, and more precisely as a means to erode the traditional pillars of U.S. military strength and challenge the United States in all warfare domains. This pursuit of advanced weapon systems could lead to new means of warfare, especially robotic and autonomous systems operating across land, sea, air, and space domains. In this capacity, the U.S. intelligence community has long monitored foreign countries' acquisition of technology outside of their own indigenous development programs. Analysis of technology transfer most intuitively includes tracking a country's acquisition of a key technology or component openly or illicitly, but also includes understanding of how actors assess technical specifications, design or engineering skills, and manufacturing and production techniques. These kinds of technology transfers can allow a country to speed up or lower the cost of development projects because they can bypass or trim the costly research and development stages. These acquisitions can not only improve foreign military capabilities, but can also accrue to them economic benefits. In this case, China is the embodiment of the military technology transfer challenge. The Chinese government has a comprehensive strategy for technology modernization to bolster China's international image, foster its national economic growth, and improve its military modernization. And technology acquisition from the United States is definitely part of that comprehensive strategy. For some time, Beijing has articulated industrial policies and long-term objectives contained in a number of comprehensive national development plans, such as its well-known 5-year plans and its Made in China 2025 initiative. In these plans, Beijing has shown that it is interested in acquiring technology and expertise that is of critical economic or national security importance to the United States. In its most recent 5-year plan, Beijing identified its most critical technology priorities, including clean energy, aerospace and deep sea research, computer and information technology, and manufacturing. China is therefore prioritizing investment in and acquisition of critical future technologies that will be foundations for future innovations, both for commercial and military innovations, like artificial intelligence, robotics, autonomous vehicles, augmented and virtual reality, financial technology, and gene editing. These technologies are inherently dual use, making it difficult to draw a line between commercial versus military applications. These technologies are also likely to be foundational to future innovations and essential to the next wave of competitive high-technology products. China's development strategy is multifaceted, and its supporting infrastructure is robust. China uses multiple vectors to acquire the skills and know-how it seeks, and I would like to highlight a few of these for you. One is joint ventures, mergers, and acquisitions. Tech transfer to China is occurring in part through increased levels of investment and acquisitions of U.S. companies, which hit a record level in 2016 before dropping somewhat in 2017 and again in the first half of 2018. China's aggregate investment in U.S. technology over the past decade, from 2007 to 17, totaled approximately $40 billion and was about $5.3 billion last year. And because the Chinese Communist Party is intimately involved in planning economic activity and supporting companies, there is a great deal of coordinated investment along with other vehicles of technology transfer to accomplish China's larger stated goals. Another vehicle are research partnerships and academic collaborations. Foreign governments often use every means at their disposal to secure an advantage in technological areas, and their exploitation of academics and researchers at U.S. colleges, national laboratories, and other institutions is one of those means. China actively seeks partnerships with government laboratories to learn about and acquire specific technology and the soft skills necessary to run such facilities. China also uses collaborations and relationships with universities to acquire specific research and access to high-end research equipment. Another vector are science and technology investments. Beijing has made sustained, long-term state investments in its S&T infrastructure, and China leverages international collaborations with key pieces of this S&T infrastructure to gain technology and know-how. In 2017, China's spending on research and development was estimated at $279 billion, up more than 70% from 2010. Another mechanism are talent recruitment programs. Beijing runs multiple talent recruitment programs specifically focused on recruiting global experts who can facilitate the transfer of foreign technology, intellectual property, and know-how to advance China's science, technology, and military modernization goals. China uses these programs, such as its 1,000 Talents program, to recruit Western-trained experts to work in China on key strategic programs. Beijing also has employed Western-trained returnees to implement important changes in its science, engineering, and math curricula that foster greater creativity and applied skills at China's top-tier universities. Another mechanism it exploits is the legal and regulatory environment. China consciously uses its laws and regulations in ways that can disadvantage U.S. companies and advantage its own companies. The Chinese government uses foreign ownership restrictions, such as formal and informal restrictions, to require or pressure technology transfer from U.S. companies to Chinese entities. The Chinese government also uses its administrative licensing and approvals process to force technology transfer in exchange for the numerous administrative approvals needed to establish and operate a business in China. We also assess China will use cyber espionage and bolster its cyber attack capabilities to support national security priorities, which include technology acquisition. The IC and private sector experts continue to identify ongoing cyber activity from China. Most detected cyber operations against U.S. private industry are focused on cleared defense contractors or IT and communications firms whose products and services support government and private sector networks worldwide. And China's technology transfer mechanisms are paired with Beijing's parallel strategy of military-civilian fusion that expands civil-military integration of defense and industrial bases to facilitate the construction of a national infrastructure connecting the PLA, state-owned defense research, development, and manufacturing enterprises, and government agencies under the State Council, universities, and private sector firms. We assess that these collaborative partnerships have well supported Beijing's rapid military modernization. So what are the possible long-term consequences? Well, while the most immediate and visible effects may be related to particular military technologies, the long-term consequences could be much broader. A decline of the United States' advantage in key technology could affect our ability to set global norms and regulations for technology, control access to technology for military purposes, and reap the economic benefits we derive from commercialization. If the U.S. were to lose its technological edge, the associated loss of influence would have far-reaching implications beyond scientific disciplines to include economic, social, political, and security dynamics. Within the ODNI, we are facilitating the information exchange among the organizations responsible for the analysis of technology transfer, because this issue is global and multifunctional in reach and nature. We collaborate closely across the intelligence, counterintelligence, and law enforcement communities, as well as other national agencies, in multiple ad hoc groups and formal groups working on specific technology transfer issues. We regularly develop collection requirements and provide warning in the form of intelligence products of threats associated with technology transfer. This concludes my overview of the threats posed by military technology transfers, and I will now turn to my colleagues to continue with remarks on the impacts of these foreign activities on the U.S. and measures we are taking to thwart and deter them. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Chairman Thornberry, Ranking Member Smith, and members of the committee. It is a privilege to be back, although it's a bit of a different viewpoint from down here. I was really honored to support you in all the vital national security work you do, and was fortunate to see firsthand the bipartisan approach that you took to national security and providing for our military, so thank you. In my new role, I support the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence as he carries out his lead responsibilities within the department on behalf of the Secretary for both intelligence and security, executing the National Defense Strategy, including its direction to protect the national security innovation base. As you heard from my ODNI colleague, the Department of Defense is facing unprecedented threats to its technological and industrial base, putting at risk the capabilities critical to maintaining our military advantage. China, in particular, has made it a national goal to acquire foreign technologies to advance its economy and to modernize its military. It is comprehensively targeting advanced U.S. technologies and the people, the information, businesses, and research institutions that underpin them. It is playing the long game, using a variety of different methods to steal our information, circumvent our processes, and exploit our seams. Across the defense intelligence and security enterprise that the USDI oversees, we are making significant changes in our approach to industrial and to information security, as well as to counterintelligence. I welcome the opportunity to follow up with you in a classified session to discuss additional initiatives we are undertaking that will provide you with a more holistic picture. In our unclassified forum today, I'll touch briefly on 4 key lines of effort. First, we are elevating the private sector's focus on security through an initiative called Deliver Uncompromised. We must have confidence that industry is delivering capabilities, technologies, and weapon systems that are uncompromised by our adversaries, secure from cradle to grave. It is no longer sufficient to only consider cost, schedule, and performance when acquiring defense capabilities. We must establish security as a 4th pillar in defense acquisition, and also create incentives for industry to embrace security, not as a cost burden, but as a major factor in their competitiveness for U.S. government business. Second, through the Defense Security Service, we are implementing a more comprehensive approach to industrial and information security. We are transitioning from a compliance checklist-based national industrial security program to a risk-based approach informed by the threat and the department's technology protection priorities. However, safeguarding our clear defense contractors only protects part of our defense industrial base. The increasing ease of access to large amounts of unclassified and non-government data in the defense industrial base offers opportunities for exploitation, which in aggregation can be as damaging as a breach of classified information. To narrow this gap between protecting classified information and that unprotected unclassified information, we are developing a program protection plan to cover controlled unclassified information, including identifying the policy and resources necessary to do this. Third, using authorities provided by this committee, including Section 806 of the fiscal year 2011 NDAA and Section 1696 of last year's NDAA, we are strengthening the integrity of the supply chain, as well as establishing a pilot program to enhance information sharing with clear defense contractors. And fourth, we are enhancing our counterintelligence capabilities to better address the non-traditional collection methods being employed by our adversaries. We are adding security and counterintelligence personnel resources to the Defense Security Service, NCIS, Air Force, Office of Special Investigations, and the Army CI. Our defense intelligence components are augmenting their collection and analysis capabilities to gain a more comprehensive understanding of threats to our technologies, which will improve our intelligence support to export control reviews and CFIUS transactions. Lastly, we are increasingly relying on our partnerships with FBI, not just increasingly, but we must rely on our partnerships with the FBI, Homeland Security, and other departments to actively leverage both our individual and our collective authorities to protect the nation's critical technologies. Through these 4 lines of effort, we can help mitigate the threats to our technology and information critical to our military advantage, and by doing so, deliver uncompromised capabilities to our warfighters. We recognize that strong relationships with industry across the interagency, with our allies and partners, and with Congress are essential to that success. We thank you for your continued focus on the threat, your understanding of the impact to our warfighters and their capabilities, and your commitment to support our policies, programs, and the resources necessary to maintain our advantage. I look forward to your questions.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Smith, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you all this morning. I serve as the Principal Advisor to the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment on DOD policies for the maintenance of the U.S. defense industrial base. This includes assessing the national security impact of foreign investments. Our national defense strategy outlines a handful of critical technologies necessary for maintaining U.S. military dominance in an era of great power competition. For those capabilities with unique military applications, like missile defense and nuclear forces, the Department of Defense will continue to act as our nation's sole developer and technological first mover. But for those emerging technologies with both military and commercial uses, like artificial intelligence, we will also need to be a fast follower and adapter of commercial sector innovation. Therefore, force structure modernization requires support from both our heritage and defense and legacy and commercial defense industrial base. Chinese industrial policies of economic aggression, such as investment-driven technology transfer and illegal intellectual property theft, pose a multifaceted threat to our entire national security innovation base, a threat with the potential to create both long and short-term impacts. In the short term, their attempts to steal intellectual property, compromise our defense supply chain, and create economic dependence within the sub-tier of our industrial base chips away our relative military technological advantage. Over the longer term, spurred on by strategic initiatives like One Belt, One Road, civil-military fusion, and Made in China 2025, this potential for China to erode our underlying innovation and industrial advantage. The engine of our national defense has always been the strength of our economy. Chinese policies seek to extract technologies from Western institutions, leverage our educational system to develop its own workforce, and use subsidies and non-tariff barriers to prevent competition and to enable the creation of national champions. These national champions enjoy a protected domestic market, which they will use to their relative advantage and enable them to grow at speed and scale, and then use all the elements of the communist state to place their national commercial champions at the top of critical markets and industries globally. These commercial national actors are then directed to compete globally against the United States and Western firms while being given every subsidy and benefit that the authoritarian communist government can devise with the goal of marginalizing U.S. companies. Combating these predatory economics will require a whole-of-nation approach to both protect and promote American industry, as well as our like-minded allies and partners. From a defense industrial policy perspective, this includes modernization of the complementary protection measures of CFIUS and export controls, as well as increasing the private sector's focus on cybersecurity. On the promote side of the ledger, we need to make sure the department is a customer of choice for emerging technology providers. This will require acquisition processes that operate at the speed of relevance, as well as budget stability so we can send a clear demand signal to industry. Thank you very much for the opportunity to testify on this important topic, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Let me just ask, as I mentioned at the beginning, one of the issues with which we will deal in conference is a modernization of the CFIUS process. That has been added to the Senate Defense Authorization Bill. There is an effort in the House to not only update CFIUS, but also the export control regime, which may be considered fairly soon in the House floor. Regardless, this issue is before us, and what guidance can you, any of you, give us as far as the updating of CFIUS and export controls?
I'm happy to take that first, Mr. Chairman, and I'm sure my colleagues would also like to add on. But we think of CFIUS and export controls as complementary tools for protecting national security. Secretary has identified 3 gaps in the current regime, specifically around tech transfer through joint ventures, access to technology through non-controlling investments, an expanded review of leases and real estate purchases so we can protect investments near sensitive military sites. What we'd suggest to you is that recognizing that both CFIUS and export controls need to work in concert to address these 3 gaps.
Comment that I would like to make, sir, is that in the CFIUS process, historically, we look at one deal at a time. We don't look at the overarching pattern of such purchases or investments. I think it is the broader pattern which is actually of greater concern. We also don't look at CFIUS investments or investment candidates from the perspective of, let me just say, the intelligence gathering opportunities it offers. For example, every firm today, which even if it's not in a technology critical sector, so let me go to that extreme, but yet such firms all have highly networked software systems controlled by commercial operating systems. Every time that there is a software update to such an operating system, it affords another intrusion path into domestic networks. We don't look at Chinese investments from the perspective of the mischief that might be made simply by having foreign ownership and, in some cases, control of such avenues. So I'll leave it at that. I believe that's as far as I would want to go at this point.
So my conclusion from that is we need to update CFIUS and export controls, but it doesn't fix all the problems.
It does not remotely stop there, sir, in my opinion.
Okay. Ms. Smith.
Thank you. I mentioned in my opening remarks the idea of having an industrial policy as to what key technologies we should protect. That's very easy to say. It's incredibly complicated to implement in terms of how you do that. But just what ideas would you have in terms of what an industrial policy would look like if we basically geared our trade policy and our internal investments to make sure that we were protecting certain core technologies? I realize you could write a book in answer to this question. Please don't. But if you could just give us a little bit of a framework of what an intelligent industrial policy would look like. Because I think the president has the vague idea of the problem, and then it's just like all over the place in terms of how to solve it. What would a more coherent approach look like?
Well, I'm not going to address any of the back and forth chatter in the current environment because we're talking about a long-term strategy here. We need to recognize that whether they are specific defense products or not, many things underlie our industrial base. I might, from a large list, as you said, sir, I might pick out, for example, microelectronics. We worry about that from the point of view of having a trusted supply. Kari mentioned that in her comments. We want to know that we have an end-to-end supply of defense equipment, and I would also say commercial equipment that we can trust. The difficulty in the microelectronics arena is that an area in which the U.S. once reigned supreme, thanks to now 20-some years of Chinese investment, domestic U.S. manufacturers no longer, in all cases, make the best microelectronics. So we should be unsurprised when others elsewhere or anywhere in the world no longer seek to buy from us, but seek to buy the best.
Can I shift focus on my question a
Yes, sir.
little bit to help with that? As I mentioned early on, some of this is inevitable. I mean, the rest of the world was going to catch up. I think a lot of people underestimate the impact that World War II had on several decades of us. The entire industrialized world got blown off the face of the map, and we were the last ones standing. Basically, if you're going to fight a war, it's always good to win. It's even better to win on the road. And that left us in a very, very strong position for several decades, but that was highly unusual. So even if China wasn't doing all this nefarious stuff, and I agree with the chairman, we've got to go after the CFIUS prosperity, we're going to have to compete. And we're also, I think, part of our industrial policy is some of what we're going to need, we're going to have to get from someplace else. So would you say that, in my conclusion, that is, we need allies. We need people who have, I don't think there's anything built in America anymore that's entirely made of American parts, or anything built anywhere, for that matter, that doesn't rely on some sort of supply chain. What could we do better to make that aspect of it work, to have countries that we can trust and work with?
Well, then I'll get off that previous path and refer to my opening remarks, where we are today not drawing distinctions in our industrial policies between friends and allies and partners and people who behave in an adversarial manner. It is in our interest to make it easy for our allies and partners to cooperate and collaborate with us, as opposed to making it easy for them to collaborate with China. And it is in our interest, in my opinion, for us to make it more difficult for the Chinese to work with us. During the Cold War, there was a whole-of-nation policy such that the idea of doing a commercial deal with the Soviet Union were words that didn't fit in one sentence. We don't have such policies today.
I'll stop there. Well,
Will.
you could quickly. I've gone on too long. Go ahead.
Just very quickly, just maybe to give a tactical example of where that collaboration is taking place. As you know, the NDAA enshrined the NTIB, the National Technical Industrial Base, which is a partnership between the United States, Australia, Canada, and the United Kingdom. We're using that to do a couple of things. One, collectively, how can we work together to create a foreign direct investment screen so we can work in concert against predatory economics from unallied nations, but then also to identify areas where we can do industrial-based collaboration to benefit us more broadly.
Okay. Thank you. Sorry, Ms. Bingen, go ahead quickly.
Mr. Smith, if I can also tackle that, is from the foxhole where I see it as my job to not make it easy for China to get this technology. And so in my remarks, I hit on 4 key pieces. Security has got to be a 4th pillar in acquisition, beyond, in addition to cost, schedule, performance. And it's not right now, and it will be incredibly complex to do. We've got to put it into the regulations, into the contract mechanisms, et cetera. Second, DSS and transition, and I'll hit on that in a moment, integrity of the supply chain and increasing our CI resources. DSS and transition, it was amazing to me to see the approach we take to industrial security today is very much checklist-based. You go into a clear defense contractor, do you have the alarms, the locks, the safe? It was not looking holistically at what is the technology or capabilities that you're providing to the government, what is the threat, what are your vulnerabilities. And so they're now, based off of DOD's critical technology priority list, going into these companies that work in these areas to look more holistically at all those different pieces. It's probably going to be uncomfortable for industry, but we need them as a partner to do this if we're going to be able to deliver uncompromised.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Yield back.
Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Chairman Mac Thornberry, for holding this hearing on such an important topic. Establishing and maintaining our military's technological edge is imperative in order to increase their effectiveness and lethality on the battlefield while protecting our troops. The Department must encourage and protect research and innovation from being stolen by state and non-state actors. I am concerned by the assessments provided today, but hopeful by the attention being provided by Chairman Thornberry and the House Armed Services Committee. First, I'd like to welcome back Secretary Kari Bingen as an alumna of this committee. We appreciate your service and wish you the best. And so appropriately, the first question begins with you. And the question is additional legislation needed to protect particular technologies and associated intellectual properties with military applications? If so, what technologies are in the greatest need of protection? Why would legislation be necessary to protect them? And how should such legislation provide such protections?
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. Good to be back here. A couple areas I'd highlight. There's Section 806 this year on extending the authority for us to strengthen the supply chain. We think that's a very good measure, and we're implementing those processes now to be able to do that and excise out of the supply chain vulnerabilities. On the resource front, and we'll have to work with the committee on the specifics of this, but on the counterintelligence areas that I talked about, the greater analysis that we will have to do with our industry partners to understand where their threats and vulnerabilities are, that will require additional resources. With these CFIUS reforms, whatever final legislation comes out of that, that will place an increasing demand signal on our intelligence capabilities, so that will require additional resources. But then also, as we go through this delivering uncompromised and DSS and transition, as we look at how we implement implement protections on controlled, unclassified information, we may need to come back to you with specific legislative proposals, and we'll work with you on that.
Thank you. And if anyone else would like to respond. If not, a general question for everybody again. Is this primarily a nation-state problem? What about transnational criminal organizations, multinational corporations, or terrorist groups? What risks do non-state actors pose in transfers of U.S. intellectual property and technology?
Well, sir, those are important issues as well, but the bulk of all the information we have gathered is that China is the big problem, and I think we need to focus our efforts on first taking care of the big problems, and then absolutely we cannot afford to neglect other areas such as you suggest, but we have to prioritize.
And then particularly as you identified China, the Confucius Institutes that are located at 103 different colleges and universities across the United States Many of these are located adjacent to research facilities. Is anyone familiar with the Confucius Institutes, which has been identified by a member of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of China as a very important propaganda arm? Is anybody familiar with what's being done to try to identify these institutes as to their motives?
Speaking to your original and second question, generally, I would agree with my colleagues that this is predominantly a state actor problem, or at least that's certainly the largest, most looming problem that within that China is the most pressing threat. With the slight additional amplification that in the case of a country like China, you asked about multinational corporations. When you have state-owned enterprises, our framework doesn't necessarily capture that blurred line between a multinational corporation and a state actor itself. We are familiar with the Confucius Institutes as one more visible representation of China's global presence, including in the United States. And consistent with my earlier remarks, I would just note that that is just one of many, many footprints that Beijing has in, near, and on our campuses and research institutes that it uses as ways to overtly and less overtly collect on and maintain awareness of what's happening on those campuses and institutions. Thank you, sir.
And thank each of you, and we appreciate your service to our country.
Mr. Gallego.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses. Even before getting to Congress, I've been hearing about this, reading about this, and now even more so in Congress, I'm dismayed that I'm hearing about the diagnosis, but not necessarily the way to fix this. In the Marine Corps, you have a couple options, right? To protect yourself, you have your Kevlar, your body armor. More importantly, though, you have your rifle. And the best way to stop somebody from trying to attack you is to look tougher and make sure they know the consequences if they do attack you. I feel when we're dealing with this issue that we're talking about how to only play defense, but what are our offensive options to actually make our quote-unquote enemy understand that if they do these types of actions that is going to be painful, and obviously to a certain degree, I don't want to trigger a war, but we need to be able to have some level of deterrence so that way they actually have to make a rational calculation whether or not they're going to engage in this type of conduct. If not, I feel this is just going to continue to happen. Every year I'm going to have the same briefing, and all we're going to be talking about is about what happened and not what we can do to stop them. So I don't know who wants to take the question first, but I'd like to hear some ideas, or if we have to take this to a classified setting, that's fine too, but I'd love to hear it. And welcome back, too.
Sir, thanks. If I can start, again, from an industrial security perspective, and that's what I'm here to represent, my focus is on clear defense contractors, and I outlined the 4 areas: security, fourth pillar, DSS and transition, supply chain integrity, counterintelligence. 2 other areas, what we are branching out, and as Mr. Schinella highlighted, there is a deep concern with the cyber data exfiltration issue, and it's one that the Chinese in particular are targeting. So one of the directions that my boss, the Undersecretary, has given to Defense Security Service is to come up with that program protection plan, come up with the policies for how we control within industry that unclassified information, yet still potentially has some sensitive technical information or personal information. So that's one of the areas that we're hitting. The other one is absolutely agree with you on we are playing defense right now, particularly in the cyber domain, and we need to be playing more offense. We need to be working with the FBI, leveraging their authorities on the law enforcement front. But that will require further conversation with you, largely at the classified level, on some of the authorities and resources that we might need to do that.
At the unclassified level, I will say that it is through CFIUS and possibly FIRMA in the future and other mechanisms, it is our choice as a nation, as a matter of national policy, as to whether or not we allow investments of any magnitude and scope by China in this country.
And I apologize not to cut you off, but my point, the point that I guess I've made is that you're all describing defensive protocols and methods, right? And it doesn't really matter to the Chinese or to our foreign adversary if they know that they can get around our defenses and there is no consequences. So what are we actually doing to change the rationale, the calculations that they're going to actually do these types of things that ostensibly are illegal? What is our pushback?
Well, I mean, obviously, the administration's Section 301 investigation into Chinese intellectual property theft would be an example of that. I think more broadly, if we think about the offensive measures we can take from an industrial-based perspective, what are we doing to promote our own industrial-based capabilities, right? I think that from a DOD perspective starts with the recognition that going forward, we're going to have to not only remain the sole developer for certain bespoke military applications, but reform our acquisition processes in a way we can leverage the benefit of our entire broader economy, right? And become a customer that is able to attract the best of both the heritage defense industrial base as well as emerging commercial technology providers.
Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Lamborn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for having this important hearing. Thank you all for being here. This is an occasion where I'm going to agree with Mr. Gallego 100%, which is not a typical, not a daily occurrence necessarily, but something on this important issue I wanted to point out. And I was going to ask, and will ask the same exact question. What are we doing offensively? You've talked a lot about some great defensive measures and where we're buttoning up and making airtight the secure and vital research and technology that our defense contractors, that our government has. And I applaud you 100% for doing that. But I would like to see more in the way of consequences to the Chinese when they do this adverse behavior. I'll just make an editorial comment here. I think for too long, administrations of both parties have been rather passive in light of what's going on. I want to applaud the Trump administration that at least in the area of trade, that there is pushback going on now with talk of tariffs. I don't know how that's all going to play out, but I'm glad that that's being discussed and made a serious issue in Washington. I think that's an example of pushback that needs to happen. Let me throw out an idea, if you want to comment on this, you can. If you don't have to, if you don't want to. Should we have I think it might be interesting to have a widespread and concerted policy in our defense to put out wrong information, pretend like it's great information, great technology, and they steal it and it won't work for them, or they go down a dead end, or they waste money, or actually backfires somehow. I think that would be an interesting thing to pursue, where we start poisoning some of the technology that's ostensibly vital and healthy and good, but it messes them up when they start to pursue it. Any thoughts on that?
Maybe I could answer the first part of the question and then defer to my colleagues around that particular issue specifically, but just to elaborate, so the Section 301 investigation that the USTR led into Chinese theft of U.S. intellectual property does have some offensive measures to it. And as was publicly articulated in a memo from the White House on the 29th of May, there's obviously the tariff action that's been associated with that. There's potential for investment restrictions into the U.S. economy, and then there's the WTO case that we've taken forward specifically to dispute what the Chinese are doing. So just to be clear, there are offensive measures that are being done in response to Chinese economic aggression. I'll defer about the second question.
I'm glad to hear that.
And Mr. Lambert, I would love to follow up with you in classified session to talk more holistically at the classified level about all the different things that we are doing or looking to do.
Okay. Okay, good. And lastly, I'll finish up. There was an article in the Wall Street Journal today or yesterday about some detected Chinese hacking on our space operations. And it was on not research and development, but on the operations side, which indicates that there's an intent in the future, perhaps, to use that information to be disruptive, to disrupt operations in an offensive way, possibly in a time of conflict. Does that concern you?
Sir, that's a topic that I really do not want to discuss in a public setting. Broadly speaking, your comment taken on its face is very concerning. It's, for me, very concerning to have read about it in the papers. As my colleague Kari Bingen just said, I'd welcome the opportunity to discuss this stuff in a more closed setting.
Thank you. Well, with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back to the balance of my time. Thank you for being here.
Ms. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here. While we've raised the issue of trade policies, I wonder if you could comment, and I'm not trying to make this into a debate here in terms of trade, but we mentioned a number of areas, particularly related to China. So was it a real missed opportunity to have not moved forward on the Trans-Pacific Partnership when it comes to national security?
I'm unable to offer you an opinion on that, ma'am. I'm sorry, I'm not familiar. I just don't have the expertise to comment on Trans-Pacific Partnership versus national security.
Okay, because in many ways, maybe you'd like to comment. I think we lost that opportunity to have China be more disruptive when it comes to that. Go ahead. Did you want to comment?
I agree with the Undersecretary. It's not an issue we've looked at specifically yet, so I don't have any further comments.
Really? Okay. Maybe that's one of the problems. I mean, I think that we were aware that national security was an issue in this regard, and it's, I guess, sort of surprising to me that there wasn't that kind of weigh-in when it came to those issues. So I wanted to ask you further. We talk about a whole-of-government approach. We're often doing that. And yet, when it comes to the concerns that you're raising here, how important is it? And are you monitoring that? Are we engaging those elements of governance and government that historically or traditionally we don't think of in this area of intellectual property or endeavors? Where do you think that is? I mean, how did the Department of State, Treasury, Justice, Homeland Security contribute to technology protections? And are there other roles that the Department of Education, Health and Human Services could be playing in this regard? I mean, it's a complex issue, and I'm just looking to see to what extent do you think that that's important?
Well, I'll start. I do think it's important. I have said publicly, actually, I believe in an earlier hearing before this committee, that we somehow in the years since the Berlin Wall came down and the Soviet Union dissolved, we believed that great power competition was behind us. The National Defense Strategy, released this past January, makes a very clear set of points that we have returned to an era of great power competition, and we must treat it as such. When we believed throughout the several decades of the Cold War, when we believed we were in a great power competition for not only the hearts and minds of the world, but possibly our very existence, we treated all the matters that you're talking about, state, education, commerce, treasury, we treated all of that as if it were of existential importance, which it was. Today, we treat these individual matters, these matters as if they were individual matters, and I think what you're hearing from us is that they are not isolated issues, that they need to be treated in the large. As I was starting to answer to Mr. Gallego's question earlier, we as a nation have choices. Do we wish to admit, as we have today, 30,000 Chinese PhD students in STEM areas? Do we wish to do that? Do we think the benefits outweigh the gains? There is not a national decision in that regard as there was when we were competing against the Soviet Union. We didn't do those things. it's not for me to say whether we should or should not. I'm trying to put on the table that these apparently isolated decisions, in fact, when taken together, comprise a whole of government strategy that we do not have.
Yeah, I don't know if anyone wants to comment on Bingen, and is there one particular example that you think creates best practices in this, in a more non-traditional way of working together that we ought to be looking at more seriously? Guess not. Thank you. Thank you.
I'd be happy to follow up, ma'am.
Dr. Abraham.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A huge problem, national security issue, and the mentality of why build it when you can steal it. So we get that, and I was listening to Ms. Bingham. You had your 4 pillars, and one of those was a program called Delivery Uncompromised, I think was what it says. And my question is, for these contractors and subcontractors, is there an MBO, a management by objective policy that if they don't meet objectives, they're penalized or punished, or if they don't reach that security level, they're kicked out of the system? Is there any accountability today?
Well, so you've actually hit on the challenge and why we are taking this different approach. When a contract is awarded to a company, it's based on cost, schedule, performance. It is not based on security. And so part of this Delivery Uncompromised initiative is working through all of the details of what would that look like. What are the standards? Is there an independent verifier that does the good housekeeping seal of approval on it? How do we work with our acquisition colleagues on infusing security into acquisition policies, into the regulations, into the actual, and the COTARs, the contracting officials that help drive those decisions. So those are all the details that we're working through now. But then also, industry can't look at it the way they do today, which is this is a cost center and it's a loss to my bottom line. They have to be incentivized to look at security as this is actually going to help me make more profit.
But are they held to that standard now?
They are not.
Okay, and I'll just go to a quick second question. Classified versus unclassified, we understand that today's classified data is yesterday's outdated data, or vice versa. This data evolves so quickly and this technology evolves so quickly that it is hard to keep up with, and that if you take 2 unclassified pieces of data and perhaps marry them together, then it becomes a classified document. My question, just for my understanding, who actually has the authority to make the call as to whether a piece of data, a piece of technology is classified or is unclassified? Is it the project managers? Is it somebody in DOD? Is it somebody, what wheelhouse makes that decision on a daily basis?
The Undersecretary for Intelligence has the policy responsibility. So we set the framework and the basic standards for what those different thresholds are.
Responsibility, but do you have, and you have the authority, but do others under you also have the authority? I understand the responsibility, and that's where the bullet does stop there, but the authority can be delegated out to other people. Is that a lot of fingers going out, or is it 2 or 3 people? How does that work?
Well, in the technology arena, for example, I have original classification authority should I make a determination that a particular set of technologies upon which we're working needs to be protected, and many others do as well. Those authorities can be delegated and are delegated downward. I know there have been breaches. We had reference to that earlier on today of actual classified information. But I will go on record, sir, as saying that I believe this hearing and our witness statements and responses to questions are more about the amalgamated effect of the industrial base and technology levels as a whole, not whether or not a particular exfiltration attempt by the Chinese was successful in a particular case, but rather the whole pattern of Chinese investment in our industrial base, extraction of data, predatory joint ventures, predatory trade practices, the whole spectrum of Chinese adversarial behavior with respect to our economic and industrial base. I believe that's actually the larger concern, sir.
Well, I understand the 30,000-foot view, but I also understand the ground level view that if we have that one breach on a national security issue, it can certainly parlay into something much bigger. So,
Absolutely, sir.
I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Mr. Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, on the debate about whole government approach, I'm just concerned that you throw the term around like it's candy at a parade, because at the same time you've testified that one of you did, that Belt Road Initiative is problematic for U.S. policy. At the same time you testify that our Department of Commerce is holding bi-monthly meetings with U.S. companies and the U.S. Embassy in China to figure out ways for those U.S. companies to access projects in the Belt Road Initiative. At the same time, you talk about a whole government approach. I'm not asking you to be experts on trade or TPP, but to have some concept of what the argument was on trade trans-Pacific partnership and how it fit into leveraging U.S. economic policy and strength in Asia vis-a-vis China. Just that basic understanding would be helpful for you all. And so I don't think you're talking about a whole government approach. I think you may be talking about a whole Pentagon approach. So if there is a whole government approach, I would like to know, not from you today, but just another example. If we're in an era of great power competition, you talk about the last one we had, and we're not doing those things we did today that we did in the last one. Well, in the last one we had, we fought for open markets. We put human rights near the top of the list when we talked to North Korea. And we're not doing that today, so does that not apply to this era of great power competition? So again, I think you're throwing the term around to try to make it sound like you're doing it, but I don't think you are, and you need to get on it. You need to have a mechanism. If we only had a National Security Council mechanism that could develop a whole government approach that's used by the White House, then we might have one. So that's, I usually don't give speeches. I usually ask questions in my 5 minutes, but it's been frustrating to hear this term being thrown around, again, like candy at a 4th of July parade, and I don't think you're living up to it. So, Ms. Bingen, I wanted to ask you about a couple questions on your you made four points on what you're doing, specifically on, I think it was your third or second point about Section 806 and 1696 authorities and strengthening supply chain security in the Defense Department. That's great. That might favor larger contractors, and so because they have the capacity to absorb the costs, if you will. How are you going to ensure that smaller companies, smaller businesses that maybe have more innovative ideas can bring more flexibility to the table of the Pentagon? How are you going to ensure that they don't get tossed aside because they don't have that capacity to do the kinds of things perhaps on supply chain security that you might be asked them to do?
Yeah, Mr. Larson, that's a great question, and that's something that we'll have to work through. We're really just at the front end of that, and on 1696, we're putting together the plan for it right now. I think the pilot has to be established by early next year, 2019. So that is something that we absolutely will have to consider. I don't know that I have a good answer for you today, but it's something that we are looking into, and I'd be happy to follow up with you.
Yeah, if you could, you were staffing on the committee when we did a tour around the country with small businesses, and Chairman Schuster at the time and I went around the country and tried to find ways to bring small business more into Pentagon contracting. So just would ask you to watch that.
And then we'll also have to work with them as we do the delivering on compromise pieces. You're right, they don't have the capacity that a lot of these large folks do. So it's how do we incentivize them, and also how do we work the liability issues to encourage them to report and to make these fixes when they just don't have that big capital that the large folks do.
Yeah, and again, for me, the crux of it is that this is where some of that innovation that we need to have happen, and that Dr. Green, Mr. Griffin wants to have happen. A lot of this is going to take place in smaller companies, but we don't need to be building hurdles to make it more difficult for them to do that. So I just would ask you guys to watch that. Thank you, and yield back.
Mr. Gallagher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a great hearing to have. I think sometimes we overlook the issue of technology transfer. And just to follow up on what was said about the need to go on offense, as we're considering a few initiatives, obviously the need to strengthen CFIUS, but I would also like to call your attention to Section 217 of the Senate NDAA, which provides the USD R&E with the authority to establish or fund a nonprofit entity to help facilitate research and technology development in critical hardware-based technologies that the private sector has tended to insufficiently support and could help meet emerging security needs. And I know it's a long bill, but have you all, maybe starting with Mr. Griffin, been able to take a look at this provision, and from your initial read, do you support it?
Yes, sir, I have read that section. I've worked with some of the folks that are promulgating that initiative, and I support it.
And Mr. Chewning, I know we've had discussions on this. I'd just be interested in your thoughts on sort of that angle of the need to invest in hardware. I mean, we spend so much time talking about software and not the hardware angle.
Yes, sir, it's a great point. And to build on it, about 92% of our venture capital investment is in software. Mm-hmm. And as we think about our need for modernization roadmaps, we know hardware and company formation, in particular hardware technologies, is going to be critical. And so I think taking that language, is, in addition to exercising the authorities given to us by Congress in Section 1711 in last year's NDA, we can pull together a response.
Great. I appreciate that. I couldn't agree more. I look forward to helping this provision get over the line. I think one of the biggest challenges we face is that those of us in the room here today may understand the scope of the challenge, but much of the broader society doesn't. And in fact, I think our competitive edge in many cases hinges on more people just getting it, from the promising researcher who takes a second look at an attractive offer to join a state-connected Chinese firm, or a graduate student who decides maybe they shouldn't conduct PhD STEM research in China. And I know this hearing is about solutions for DOD, but I'd be fascinated to hear your thoughts on how we can better communicate the story we're hearing today to the broader population. And in reading sort of the DIUX report on technology transfer, I mean, one of the key proposals is outreach to the private sector and academia. And so I guess maybe a question, let's just go down the panel that way. I mean, how can we more effectively conduct that outreach to the private sector, to academia, and to society more broadly? I know it's a big question, but.
Well, I think, and it's a great question. I think increasingly through our industry association engagement, and not just with the types of folks you think we'd be talking to, but more broadly, increasingly we're hearing those concerns from the industry associations. And I think it's the need to begin to separate the need for an incremental revenue opportunity where you may be going into a new market, to the longer lens necessary, recognizing that you're going to be doing business with someone who eventually wants to put you out of business, and the need to get that message across.
Yeah. And can I just put maybe a finer point on it? I mean, we've had these recent stories about certain Silicon Valley companies not wanting to do business with DOD because of sort of it intersecting with lethal drone operations, right? I mean, that's a huge problem. If at the time when we need to be working more closely with the Googles, with the Amazons, with the Facebooks of the world, that's sort of the cultural reaction to working with DOD. I just wonder if you could just comment on that briefly, and how do we turn that conversation around? If that makes any sense, yeah.
Absolutely, sir.
Yeah.
We're disappointed in that, but we also know, particularly artificial intelligence, that's where the talent, that's where the technology is. The government is not leading in this area, so we need to be able to leverage that. They look at, when I think about the numbers of transactions, the data sets that they have, Some of our problems may be pretty straightforward for them, given what they do in the commercial sector, and we've got to be able to leverage that. So for us, from an intelligence perspective, we have a clear mission imperative. We have manual, labor-intensive processes that our analysts undertake every day. We've got to make it better for them and use their brain power more effectively. But department-wide, there are a lot of other challenges that we have, logistics, business reforms, et cetera, that would benefit from them. And we've got to believe that there are folks there that bleed red, white, and blue and want to participate in hard national security, want to participate and support national security, but also that the engineers like hard problems, and we've got good ones for them to work on.
Sure. Well, I've run out of time. I have a bunch of other questions that we won't get to, but thank you for what you're doing. This is an important subject, and I yield the balance of my time, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Langevin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank our witnesses for your testimony here today. Like many of my colleagues, I believe a comprehensive whole-government approach is really needed to maintain U.S. technological superiority, as you've heard from many of my colleagues, and because the problem we run into is that less democratic states have no trouble marshaling their collective resources to their advantage. So what are your recommendations to Congress for policies that maintain our technological edge in critical areas by countering activities of other nations while also fostering a culture of innovation in the United States?
Well, I'm fond of saying that the best way to get ahead and stay ahead is to work harder, run faster. We believe that our free market capitalist-based system is the seed of innovation to a far greater extent than any command economy can achieve. And indeed, the entire topic of this hearing is about China stealing from us, not about us stealing from China. So if we can provide the kinds of incentives that my colleagues have been talking about, we just mentioned 217 for new authorities for hardware-based venture companies. If we in the DOD can, using the authorities that you've given us, learn to deal with our industrial base on a more commercial basis, on a quicker and more responsive manner that is not so burdensome to our companies, I think those actions will help us stay ahead. The mere recognition that we are in a competition and that we should not be making it easier for our adversary will help us. My colleague, Kari Bingen, outlined, and our statement outlines 4 broad areas that we are very serious about. So other than those more general statements, I don't know that I have any very specific things to recommend to you.
Okay. Thank you. Ms. Bingham, do you have anything to offer?
I think I would just echo what Dr. Griffin just highlighted.
Okay, let me...
My job, sir, I look at my job as slowing the Chinese and others down from getting our stuff. His job is to push the envelope on that, our own technology investment and our own R&D. And my fear right now, or my big concern is what's being taken from us now, the R&D that we're both, and that S&T that we're both competing for, we're both interested in the same things right now. That is what's going to show up on the battlefield 5 to 10 years from now. And that's what we need to slow down our adversaries and then speed up our own capabilities.
Let me amplify my comments, sir, with just one short statement. One of the best assets we have is, in fact, the openness of our society and our alliances and partnerships with our Western allies. The more that we can find ways to do things jointly with them and binding them to us, that is a positive step we can take, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. So let me ask you this. There are many promising ideas that the department has invested intellectual equity in, only to see those ideas and programs end up in the valley of death. So recognizing the remaining utility, other entities certainly can swoop in and swoop up any gains made at that point and move forward from there. So I find this troubling. I'm sure you do as well. With programs like hypersonics and directed energy, where we invested, but our competitors have taken our ideas and our investments and continue to innovate. So do you deem it a risk when we've worked on and developed a technology but failed to fund the transition? Are there policy impediments that slow technology transfer to our own forces?
Well, sir, the National Defense Strategy released in January frankly makes a big deal out of the point you have just raised and has specific modernization, force modernization goals for the future fight that are outlined in that strategy. And we are working today, this week, this month, next month to enshrine these, to codify these in the upcoming budget preparation. We have done groundwork, important groundwork in directed energy, especially in hypersonics, especially that we have, if you will, let lie for a while when we should have been turning it into actual force. We're trying to reverse that trend. We're working with all deliberate speed to do that. The two areas that you mentioned, hypersonics and directed energy, are major candidates for revectoring. I'm working on that as we speak.
Thank you. Well, the sooner the better. I know my time's expired.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
I'll yield back. Thank you for your testimony.
Mr. Heiss.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Griffin, in the written testimony earlier, it was discussed and brought up the need to better balance risk with speed when it comes to prototyping. Can you expound on that a little bit and explain why that's so important?
My favorite topic, sir. That's because in my more useful years, I did that for a living. I now hope to enable others to do it for a living. I think the key point that I would make is that if we can return to what used to be this country's ace in the hole, our ability to try out new ideas, cobble them together in prototype fashion, take them to the test range, fly them off, see how they work, fix them where they break, and plump them up where they're doing good, then let operators interact with them, because designers and operators need to work together. When we can develop new things in that fashion, that is the best of this country. We have let our processes get in our way, and by that I mean our legal and contracting processes. The Congress has bent over backwards to offer broader permissions by which we might undertake these developments. And if I have a single mission in life as the new Undersecretary in this area, it is to get our guys in the field working again on these new ideas and let nature tell us which ones are good. The key point is it's important to recognize that a test failure is not a failure. The failure is when we don't stick to the goal and get the product to the finish line.
Very good. Well, I'm glad to hear that. And secondly, I'd like to kind of follow up on where Dr. Abraham was going a little bit earlier, and I'm not sure exactly who this would be addressed to, so maybe even a couple of you have an answer. But how do we incentivize companies to comply with the deliver uncompromised?
Sir, that's something we're working through right now. We've had actually an FRDC come on board and do a study for us, and we're working through those recommendations. But some of this is going to be outside our area too, where it comes back to, you know, how do they look at this so it's not a cost, but it's a profit for them. How do we get them to encourage them to self-report, but not think that there's going to be a liability or a penalty associated with that? So are there tax incentives we can pursue, regulatory incentives, safe harbor ideas? So we're working through all of those right now. But we do think that there are some concrete ideas that we can explore to do those incentives.
Well, and I think that's extremely important to solidify this. Would you agree?
Absolutely, sir, and the sooner the better.
Does anyone else have a comment?
Yes, sir. I mean, we need, through combination of public policy, tax code, selection criteria for our procurements, we need to make it in the interests of our industrial base to protect their own intellectual property from theft. When it is in their interest to do so, when it is a profit center rather than a cost center, when they care about it as much as we do, then that will turn around.
Okay, well, while you're going on that, how well integrated is the executive branch on the whole threat here?
That might be above all of our pay grades put together, sir.
I mean, but you're dealing with this, just from your observation.
Well, it depends upon who you talk to, really. The interests of the primary interest of the Commerce Department is to promote commerce. The primary interest of the intelligence community, I won't speak to that. We have intelligence community representatives, but as Kari has said a couple times, their goal is to protect what we have. Those two imperatives can be in conflict.
So is DOD and the intelligence community cooperating, at least?
I think we are, sir.
Daily, weekly, monthly basis.
Okay.
And I go to all those meetings.
All right. Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Ms. Hartzler.
Thank you very much. Thanks for being here on this very, very important topic. There was a recent article in Foreign Policy magazine that discussed how China has created a sophisticated state surveillance system with facial recognition technology, specifically to target minorities and what they call anti-China behavior. And they developed this system with the help of Chinese surveillance firms like Hikvision. Now, Hikvision is about 42% owned by the Chinese government, and the chairman of Hikvision's board was quoted as saying that the board must ensure the company, quote, creates a state-owned enterprise and that it remains, quote, under direct control of the Communist Party Central Committee. In fact, Hikvision received $3 billion line of credit from the state-owned China Development Bank, and this is one of the three so-called policy banks whose financing objectives follow political motives. And I'm sure you can imagine that I was alarmed when I learned that Hikvision cameras were operated at a military installation in my district. The cameras have since been removed, but I am disturbed that the federal government willingly purchased these cameras knowing that China is actively engaged in espionage against the United States. So my question is, I'm deeply concerned that video surveillance and security equipment sold by Chinese companies exposes the U.S. government to significant vulnerabilities due to potential built-in backdoors, creating a video surveillance network for China purchased by the taxpayer and installed courtesy of the U.S. government. I would like each of you to discuss the security vulnerabilities posed by Chinese surveillance cameras and whether or not you believe it's a security risk to have them operating at U.S. government facilities. So, Mr. Schinella, you want to start?
Sure. That's everything you've laid out there is consistent with some of the threats which we tried to point the flashlight out in our opening statement. You've got essentially a state-owned or certainly state-invested company, and you've got an example of the sort of, you could characterize it as an insider threat, if you will, but the Chinese government's relationships with these kinds of companies, which have a worldwide commercial presence, poses exactly the sort of threat you've identified. And as my colleague articulated, it's also an indication of the different kind of world we had. We weren't buying surveillance cameras from the Soviet Union in those days, but when you've got Chinese companies making world-class equipment on a global market, they pose a threat that is different than we faced during the Cold War.
And ma'am, if I might, it's obviously a concern and something that we're actively working. There are other additional examples like that that we'd happy to take you through in a classified setting to discuss similar vulnerabilities that we've identified and then what we're doing to remediate them.
Be great.
And Ms. Hartzler, if I can also just add, going back to the supply chain discussion we had and the policies associated with that and the congressional engagement and the direction that you all provided us, you know, there are three areas of the supply chain I worry about. It's going through the front door, the cyber exfiltration, and us making it easy for them. It's two, it's exactly what you highlighted. It's the backdoor piece. But then third, there's also the counterfeits part piece. And we need to be able to look holistically at all of those and mitigate threats along all three of those vectors, which the authorization you provided us helps us to start doing.
Mr. Griffin, you have anything to add?
Shockingly for me, I have nothing useful to add. Thank you, ma'am.
You bet. Mr. Schinella and also Mr. Griffin, you mentioned in your comments concerns about the universities and the Chinese using the universities. That's something I'm very concerned as well. The National Intelligence Council, you provided us with this chart that shows the different programs that China has in talent recruitment, and of the snapshot that is provided here, approximately 2/3 of these individuals worked or studied in the U.S. and are employed in China in areas such as defense, research, technology, state-owned enterprises, academia, and things. Now, Mr. Griffin, you said it's not up to me to give a recommendation, so I'll ask Mr. Schinella. Do you think we should change our visa system to deny Chinese students be able to participate in PhD programs?
Well, as part of the U.S. intelligence community, it's even less my mandate to make policy recommendations, but as the intelligence product you have illustrates, and as my opening remarks indicated, China, through a state-directed policy, absolutely is trying to make the most licit and illicit, but often through absolutely legal mechanisms, exploitation of their ability to take advantage of the U.S. university system.
Thank you. Time's up.
Mr. Bacon.
Thank you very much. We appreciate your all's time today. I wanted to ask you a question about some of the areas that we're seeing bigger advances with technology. Of course, we keep seeing advances in stealth. We're seeing higher capacity computing power, which is changing a lot of our weapon systems, hypersonics, robotic type investments, and also nanotechnology. So a few of these, I just want to ask you a question. How did we fall behind in your mind in the hypersonics side? Because that's what I keep reading. And what can we learn from that? And I just open up to anybody.
Well, let me take that one first. We fell behind because while this nation was pioneering in that era, we decided some years back that we did not face a significant threat requiring the delivery of force by means of hypersonic weapons. Mm-hmm. So we, as an earlier questioner asked, we didn't transition those weapons. Right. We could have, we just chose not to. Our adversary, China, has gone on to develop a very, very startling capability in that area. We certainly can match and exceed that capability, and we are setting about that task. But we fell behind because we elected to make other choices, sir.
And it's primarily the focus on the Middle East, I would assume. Afghanistan and Iraq probably preoccupied our bandwidth.
There is always the tyranny of the urgent versus the long term, and truly, I lived through all of this, Cold War competition and such. One of my political adversaries once labeled me as an unreconstructed Cold Warrior. It was not offered as a compliment, but I took it as such. So we have for 25 years believed that the era of great power competition was over, and it's not.
Let me ask you, I've been reading about robotic technology and that Russia is investing a lot into that. Would you say that where are we at with that compared to the Russians, if you can elaborate, if anybody wants to?
I don't believe that I know. I can give you an assessment for the record later, sir. I will say that in the area of autonomy, machine learning, robotics generally, that as my colleague said earlier, and quite well deserves emphasis, the DOD is a small player with regard to where commercial industry is. Now, that's not bad. Our commercial industrial base is the biggest single asset that we have for national security. But we need to make it attractive for them to continue work in this area, and we need to make it attractive for them to partner with us so that we can reap those advantages.
One last question in this line, and I'll give somebody else a chance to answer any of these, but on nanotechnology, I keep reading the importance of maybe 20, 30 years from now, what miniaturization will be able to do to the battlefield. Can you talk about that at all? Because it fascinates me that we'll be able to maybe have weapon systems that are quite a bit smaller and harder to detect, and perhaps just as lethal as what we have today. Yeah.
I mean, I think the innovations you're describing are exciting on a lot of fronts because of the warfighting applicability they have. I also think it draws on an important distinction that we've talked a lot about the type of innovation that we're expecting industry to push to us. There's also a pull effect. And the innovation of our warfighters to take technologies like you're describing, experiment with them so we can determine how they will impact doctrine going forward, and then providing that feedback to industry. And so I think this push-pull concept around how we divine this innovation, we take commercial insight, figure out what the military applicability are, is an important part of the equation.
Anybody else want to jump in on any of those questions?
Mr. Bacon, I'll go outside my lane a bit. No, that's probably dangerous. You know, I do want to bring this back to China a bit as well. And when I look at some of the trends out there, and frankly, it's less about us protecting ours, but this is really us making it a national priority in some of these technology areas. They've got 16 mega projects. These are Manhattan-style projects. Their global share of R&D expenditures, the U.S. dropped 11% between 2000 and 2015. China increased 21%. STEM degrees is 2014 data, but Chinese universities are putting out 1.3 million students with STEM backgrounds. We are 525,000. So just what I think of those numbers and what that portends for the future, you know, the onus is on us to really make these challenges and these technologies a national priority.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. And Mr. Chairman, if we got time at the end, I got about one more minute question if we come back around. But I yield.
Mr. Banks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Griffin, I, along with 25 members of Congress this week, sent a bicameral and bipartisan letter to the Secretary of Education earlier this week on Tuesday that expressed our concern about Huawei's links to the Chinese government. Huawei has so-called, quote, research partnerships with over 50 U.S. universities and is likely using these relationships to exploit the open and transparent culture of our schools and communities, as well as gain access to critical next-generation technologies. We know that China has used relationships like these for spying, conducting cyber attacks, and committing industrial and economic espionage. Meanwhile, the DOD policy that governs technology transfer is dated back to 1999. At that point, we had no idea what an iPhone was. We were worried about Y2K, and the USB flash drive wasn't even invented. The world, as I'm sure you would acknowledge, is very different technologically now than it was 19 years ago. So, Dr. Griffin, considering the emerging nature of strategic competition with China and the increasing need to protect our critical investments in both academic and private partnerships, what is the DOD doing to protect the DOD-funded research from foreign threats and unvetted members with uncertain loyalties? And what specifically are you doing to assist the Secretary of Education in mitigating risk to universities and other schools and help the federal government to protect and advance the United States technological advantage?
Sir, that's a bigger question than I believe I can answer here for the record. I think Eric might be more capable than I. I share your concern. I've several times alluded in this hearing to the number and, in fact, the existence of so many Chinese STEM students in the United States. I completely share your concern, and it's well documented that this is an avenue of access for the Chinese that we'd not want them to have. Beyond that, I don't have any detail for you. Eric?
Aside, before we move to Eric, are you too concerned about the dollars that fund academic research on universities in America that on our behalf are engaged in classified research for DOD?
I am concerned that we
that have ties to Huawei and other
I am concerned that we are not yet as vigilant as we should be about making sure that that research doesn't go to places that have those ties. Certainly, universities have a very long, multi-decade history of collaboration with the national security community writ large on problems of national interest. It's one of our greatest strengths. But doing so in an environment that can be penetrated by adversaries is not wise, and we are looking more closely at that.
So, Mr. Chewning, you would agree that we're not as vigilant as we should be, as Dr. Griffin
Yeah, no,
said?
Agree 100%. We are concerned. We are reviewing the contract language associated with those research projects at the universities. And I think more broadly, this hits on the hard issue of we have an open innovation model, and we have an adversary that's within that model and operates a closed model on their own side, and that we need to experiment to find what the structural fix is for that without breaking what makes our system work the best in the world.
Are either of you aware at all of any interest by the U.S. Department of Education and these ties or this subject at large? Have you had any conversations with any leaders at the Department of Education?
I have not. I would be happy to do so, but I personally have not. And of course, another difference between now and 1999, which you cited, was that China had not been admitted to the World Trade Organization in 1999. And I might make the point that that was truly a seminal branch point that allows many of the types of intrusions of which you speak.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
Let me follow up with just one question for Mr. Schinella and probably Ms. Bingen. As a practical matter for our purposes, should we see any distinction between a Chinese company and the Chinese government? So if a Chinese company is investing in some technology, some business, something going on, as a practical matter for our purposes, should we see that as the Chinese government doing it?
I would say there's a gradation, but whether you've got a wholly owned, state-owned company that essentially is an element of the Chinese government, or largely a genuinely private company that the Chinese government still has leverage over back within China, there may be a spectrum of risk, but I would say that at no point on that spectrum is the risk zero.
Okay. Ms. Bingen, you have anything to add?
Mr. Chairman, I just add the China National Intelligence Law from 2017 says that all organizations and citizens shall support, cooperate with, and collaborate in national intelligence work.
Yeah, that's kind of what I thought. Mr. Bacon, you had a quick question?
One quick follow-up. I know CFIUS has a very important role, and we need to protect our technology and make sure it's not being sold or exported, particularly prematurely. Well, I have a concern. I've heard from a couple of companies where they thought they were unfairly limited. So when I've asked CFIUS about this, they go, well, we're our own appeal authority. I'm wondering, from the DOD perspective, shouldn't we not have an appeal authority somewhere in the DOD to say, in case CFIUS gets it wrong once or twice on whatever company that they hold back? You got any thoughts on that?
Well, Congressman, if there's any specific case, of course, we're always able to provide briefings to members, explain the rationale and the logic behind why a decision occurred the way it did. I will say, as the representative for the department on the interagency committee, companies may not be aware of the full fact base that we have because we conduct the RBAs as they're informed by the intelligence community, and so I could see why certain companies may not think we got it right because they don't have the picture that we do based on the work from the intelligence community.
And I got that. I think, and I would say 99% of the time that's probably the case, but shouldn't there not be some kind of recourse outside of CFIUS? Because what I'm hearing is your own appeal authority, and granted, I'm sure you get it right 99% of the time, but I still think from a just fairness that there's got to be some kind of board at the DOD level just to. And it gives you a chance to say, hey, this is why we made that case, and people could agree or disagree. But I think some of the companies would say there is no other appeal authority other than CFIUS itself. And it seems to me there needs to be a check and balance there. And I throw that out as a suggestion.
Sure. No, thanks. No, well, I'm certainly happy to take that feedback back to the committee and discuss it.
Thank you.
As luck would have it, votes have been called. So this worked out just right. Thank you all for being here and for your insights. We will obviously continue to have conversations on this topic. Hearing stands adjourned.
Thank you, sir.